My name is Eric Esker. Can you hear me okay? Oh, yeah. Is that all right? Okay. If at any point you can't hear our speaker, please just raise your hand and politely ask him to talk a little more into this. There's an art to holding this and talking into this. I'm Eric Esker. I'm one of the co-directors of the Humboldt Interdisciplinary Institute for Marijuana Research. Welcome. This is our second speaker of the year. We've got 2, possibly 3 more coming up in the spring. And if you go to our website, you can take a look at who's coming up. And all the speaker series are open to the public, and you're all welcome to attend. There are different topics coming up. In February, I have to check the exact date. We have somebody coming up who's going to be looking at cannabis and differences, generational use, baby boomer use, and then we're also going to have an ND come in the spring. That's what we're hoping for to talk about some dispensary issues and medical issues. So, but that's in the future. Welcome. Today our guest is Jeffrey Raber, Dr. Jeffrey Raber, and I've written a few things down about Jeff. First of all, we should congratulate him on being here. I told him to come here early, knowing how difficult it is to travel in and out. He's coming from Southern California, and he called me yesterday about 11 in the morning and said, my flight has been canceled. And I said, the only way you can for sure get here is if you drive up. And he is such a trooper, he did that. Yeah. So we're all very happy he did that.
Thank you.
So he's been up through a lot, so please show your appreciation throughout the talk and then afterwards. So Jeff is a PhD organic chemist. He got his PhD from USC and in organic chemistry, and his undergraduate degree from Lebanon Valley College in Pennsylvania. Yeah. Dr. Raber has published an article just this year titled "Determination of Pesticide Residues in Cannabis Smoke" in the Journal of Toxicology, a peer-reviewed journal. He's presented nationally, indeed internationally, and he recently returned from Prague, where he gave a presentation on his research. Jeff is the president of Kinetic Chem and the founder of the Workshop in Southern California, an independent laboratory serving the unmet public health and safety needs within the medical cannabis community. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Raber.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm sorry to do this. I should know this right in the beginning. And I also want to say, some of you see this around where you're seated. A little form here. This is a donation form for our institute. California has fallen on hard times recently, and we would like to keep speaker series and things like that going, and being able to fund folks like Jeff and others coming up here. So I'm just going to make a quick ask of you to consider picking up one of these on your way out, and consider making a donation to the Institute. All of your proceeds will go to various things, including our bringing speakers here, like Jeff. So anyway, consider that. Here's Jeff Raber.
Thank you, Eric, for that kind introduction, and thank everybody for showing up this evening. It's quite an honor to be in Humboldt State University to talk about this topic. I think everyone, rightfully or wrongfully so, it's synonymous with Humboldt that you talk about cannabis. So for me, it's quite an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I hope you all enjoy this evening, and certainly feel free at the end to ask any questions whatsoever. A little bit about our entity, the Workshop, which is the company in Pasadena which goes about testing medical cannabis throughout California. We will soon be in Washington as well. We started this company in 2010 with the idea of sustainability. So as a scientist thinking about the future, what should we do to harness our medications, to harness textiles and other products? Plants seem like the most sensible source. They are absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. If we have an environmental issue, such as I believe we all currently have and are experiencing, it certainly makes sense to harness the CO2 that is causing a lot of that greenhouse problem. So how can we look at plants a lot better, and how can we utilize them in every possible fashion? And our first goal was to start with cannabis. There's a huge unmet need within the cannabis community as far as what actual strains are providing, what these chemicals are present within each of the varieties, and also, maybe even more importantly so, the unmet public health and safety need that goes along with what contaminants are present in terms of pesticides or microbiological contaminants. So our goal was to set some standards in a scientific sense as far as what should we look for in terms of quality control and purity within these products. And that was how we started the Certified Cannabinoid program. So the little CC logo that you see up there symbolizes that we have actually taken the sample, understood where it came from, at least from the bag that we sampled it from, so the sample was collected properly, and then tested that in an independent fashion. And certainly public health and safety is the first and foremost goal. And as Eric mentioned, we did publish a peer-reviewed literature article this year. We were the first commercial cannabis laboratory to do that. And that certainly gives me great pride to be able to say that. We're a team of professional scientists, myself and some other individuals with PhDs, and also some Dutch experience with 8 years of experience in the Netherlands, understanding cannabis within their national medical program and also at one of the universities there. So talking about cannabis, why is this so important and why is everybody so interested in it? We have to understand cannabinoids. And what was most interesting to me when I took a fresh look at this plant and the medical aspects of it, when I became aware of the law within California, was that only in 1992 did we discover an endogenous cannabinoid known as anandamide. And that means a cannabinoid from within. So our body actually makes compounds that activate receptors similar to the fashions that THC or the other molecules within the cannabis plant actually do. And that, to me, is pretty fascinating. You have a whole system designed around regulation, around what we call homeostasis, trying to find balance within the patient, within the individual. And how does this system actually respond to these types of compounds? So we found the receptors in the late 1980s, and we have to keep in mind that these are our definitions and not our body's definition. So we'll call them CB1, CB2, CB whatever number they are. Whether they only act there or not certainly remains to be seen. I think it's far more complex than that. But for the sake of discussion and so that we can all further understand things in a better fashion, we've called them cannabinoid receptors because this is where cannabinoids act first and foremost. And they are lined throughout our body, like completely, within the brain, within the eye system, the peripheral nervous system, and explicitly within the gut. They are certainly one of the biggest nervous systems you have is your intestinal system and your digestive system. And there are a lot of cannabinoid receptors present within that. So when I looked at this and said, well, we have receptors, we have molecules. Anandamide is one. We now know of about 8 other ones, and certainly even other ones we don't call endocannabinoids, but that are also impacting the same system. It seems hugely important to try and understand this system and ways that we may be able to modulate it with a natural resource. And that's why cannabis, to me, is so interesting. And I'm sure you've heard of the large number of potential ailments that may be mitigated or potentially alleviated with the use of cannabis. And why are there so many? It's because this endocannabinoid system is so complex and so critical to so many of the core functions of the body. It really is about trying to help you find your natural ease, your balance. So not dis-ease, which is the state of being sick, but the one that makes you comfortable. And if you go a little further, maybe a little happy, which I think is a pretty good side effect. So what is this natural system of balance? And here is a small graphic. It's only part of it. This graphic keeps growing. I've seen the recent reports where there's about another third of it that's expanded. And this is some of the impact, like some of the definitions that we map out in terms of what the endocannabinoid system actually is. You'll see on the bottom side here, like CB1, CB2 receptors, GPR55, which we may also call CB3. Again, those are our definitions. And TRPV1. And anandamide acts on those. And you'll see anandamide, 2-AG is another endocannabinoid, and you'll see them present in multiple places. And you'll also notice COX-2, cyclooxygenase 2, and FAAH. Those are where aspirin may work in cyclooxygenase 1 and 2. There's isoforms of that. And those are related to pain and inflammation. And all of these systems together link to form a dynamic equilibrium that when you impact it can lead to balance and help you feel much better than you're feeling without those things. So we are, as people, trying to constantly come into balance with our environment. What's in our environment? The air we breathe, the food we eat, the things that are on the food that we eat, and maybe our irritating brother or relative that's also giving some stress in some fashions. So how do we mitigate or balance those and counterbalance those? It certainly matters everything that we put into our body. And our body's designed to balance those in multiple ways. It's not a single lock and key. It's many locks and many keys that may be turned in many different directions or different intensities. And the endocannabinoid system is really that core system that has that entire balancing act going on. So modulating that in the right way is, I think, extremely important, and that's what we are all trying to figure out, and we definitely do not have much of that figured out at all. I like to use this graphic to talk a little bit more about cannabis and some of the components present within it, and its broad-based medical utility. And you'll notice all around the circle that there are many, many different ailments, from anti-cancer, antibacterial, bone stimulation, anti-stress, anti-anxiety. And what's most interesting about this graphic to me is that THC is not on there. So this is all of the other potential that you can have from cannabis without THC. So I think, the media likes to talk about THC. We hear a lot more of THC from a recreational standpoint or adult use standpoint. And while it does have extreme medical utility and works together with other components, there's a whole lot more to the cannabis plant than just THC and the euphoric effects that may come along with it. So why is the cannabis plant looked at as being maybe better than other pharmaceutical agents? There are certainly single molecule pharmaceutical agents present on the market. Marinol or dronabinol are certainly known, but we hear quite often from patients who have had those that has not been as effective as the plant material. And whole plant cannabis consists of far more than just that one cannabinoid. And as you've seen on that last slide, there are certainly some more cannabinoids, and I'll talk about the other couple hundred chemicals that have been found within cannabis as well. And all of these compounds work together to help your body form that balance. And it was explained to me by Dr. Andrew Weil. He gave a great presentation that said plants offer all of these molecules to the body at once. And the body can then select and choose which ones are needed to go back to its natural state. And if none of the compounds are harmful, you don't have any side effects. And plants offer a very different medical approach than single molecule pharmaceuticals. So you'll see quite often anti-HIV medications or patients that are succumb to AIDS, HIV, that they have to take lots and lots of medication, like many more than one pill. And while some pills are effective, they cause side effects, and to mitigate the side effects, I need other pills. And to keep going down this train, I end up with handfuls of pharmaceutical agents. And plants kind of offer all of those at once, and your body can take what it needs, and it is a much more gentle and safer approach than perhaps like which magic bullet might I try and give you at each time. And plants can certainly synthesize these things a lot better than we can too. So to me, the cannabis plant and all that it offers inside of cannabinoids and also the emerging area of terpenes, which I'll talk a little bit more about, seems exceptionally available to me and very interesting in terms of helping us regulate our body in very harmless and helpful fashions. Some of the other chemicals that I've been mentioning, there's cannabinoids, which I think everybody has heard about. Some of those are THC, and CBD has become more prevalent with Sanjay Gupta's latest episode. Terpenes are related to the smell and the taste, but they also have predominant physiological effects. And I'll describe why we can say that now today. And the other class of compounds that are predominant within cannabis are called flavonoids. These are antioxidant type ones, and there are a few that are predominantly known only to cannabis, but you most likely will not be ingesting them through any inhalation, vaporization type modes, and even extracts probably don't have very much of them either. Only if you're eating whole raw plant would you actually be consuming much of those. So before I go too much further, I'll give a little bit of a chemistry background, and I think it's important that we always define our terms. And the term phytocannabinoid we use to say derived, made by the plant. The plant, cannabis, is actually making these types of cannabinoid compounds. And four of the most prevalent ones that we see are listed up here: THCA, CBDA, CBGA, and much less prevalently CBCA. You probably all heard more so about the processed cannabinoids, and those would be what happens when you heat them up and you lose that key part. Go back. You'll see the carboxylic acid group right here. That leaves as a CO2 molecule upon heating or long-term storage. And you get then molecules that you hear much more prevalently, THC, CBD, and even CBG. And these are also what are formed when you vaporize or inhale through combustion. So any type of heating, baking processes, maybe, depends on exactly how that's prepared, they can be present within that. So how does the plant actually go about putting these things together? It starts with two common precursors listed up there at the top, olivotolic acid and geranyl pyrophosphate. And using its certain enzymes, it stitches those together to form the common intermediate CBGA. It's much easier to say that. And then what the plant does, depending on its genetics and what's actually been expressed by its genetics, is it uses certain enzymes to go and create the other molecules, either THCA or CBDA. And that's all the plant produces. So I want to be very clear, and this is usually a shock to many people, that the cannabis plant does not produce THC. It doesn't have THC produced by any machinery in the plant, nor CBD. There may be trace amounts of it present on the material because of time and having that decarboxylation event happen, or it's formed by heating, which is a human intervention. So while there's tiny amounts on there from natural degradation, there's no plant machinery that we know of today that actually makes THC or CBD. It only comes from us intervening and trying to drive it in that fashion, either through vaporization, heating inside of a butter mixture and oil that's been baking, or a side of combustion with a lighter and a flame. You'll hear a lot about CBN, and I think that's quite unfortunate because it's really not prevalent anywhere in any way, shape, or form. It's an artifact of analysis. So improper preparation of analytical methods leads to the degradation of THC, which then results in the misidentification or understanding that CBN is actually present. Using proper analytical methods, you don't hardly ever see this, and the plant has no machinery to make it. It really takes like years worth of old material to actually start to find any sort of appreciable amounts of CBN. It's a very, very slow process to form that. It's an oxidative degradation from THC. And certainly understanding how to handle the material properly, you don't see very much CBN at all. And I use this because unfortunately there are a number of other analytical approaches out there that are generating it, and it may be misleading. Single molecule studies of CBN in the 70s showed that it caused hypothermia and muscle loss, like types of muscle movement loss. So I don't think it's anything that many people would very much be desiring in any way, shape, or form. I certainly wouldn't. So what do we see in the California market, which is always interesting when you speak internationally or in other states or try and talk to regulators about regulating cannabis? It's not just plant material. There are many, many forms that the plant material ends up in as far as an analytical laboratory that you need to go and investigate. So certainly there are plant material products like the flowers or trim and leaves and other concentrated forms. It can also be placed in topicals, creams and lotions and things of that type. And certainly many, many orally consumable or sublingually consumable products such as tinctures, brownies, cookies. And when I spoke in New Jersey years ago, I told them anything that you can consume in a baked good, I'm sure I've seen cannabis within that. California has an eclectic market in that context, and I think that's part of the individual expression, which is also great because there's a lot of different individual people who have a different palate, and they might like to consume their medication in a variety of ways. So self-expression and individuality, I think, is also expressed by the plant, and I would only serve to encourage that. From a laboratory standpoint, we need to focus on two things, precision and accuracy. And it's a matter of how tight are my arrows clustered together, and am I sure that they're actually in the center of the bullseye? So that first part is the precision. How close are my arrows together? And I really want them coupled tight. So if everybody brings me the same concentrate, I can get the exact same value out of it. If the same thing is sent to our lab time and time again in a different named context, or they blind test us, we should be able to get the exact same number. And that is exceptionally important from an analytical laboratory standpoint. You may have heard, especially up here, that labs don't always know what they're doing, and they may end up with different results. If you prepare the sample in the right fashion, the lab should give you the same value. Whether that's the absolute true value is a separate question. But a ground-up sample, a homogenized sample, and the best sample you can give a lab is a concentrate, because it shouldn't be any different. The plant is known to differ in its THC content depending on how it's cultivated. Sometimes the bottom of the plant can contain 10% THC, whereas the top has 20% or more. That's an enormous variability. So if someone says, I took the same plant and gave it to this guy and gave it to this guy again, did they actually grind up the flower material before they submitted it to the lab, or was one bud from the bottom and one bud from the top? To eliminate all those problems, that's why we take our samples. So we're sure that we're getting a representative sample of what was ever packaged in the bag or what's present there at the cultivation facility. Not every lab does that, though, so I would like to stress that it really is a matter of scientific integrity as to how you're collecting the sample. And the other part of this equation is accuracy. So how do I know I'm actually in the center of the bullseye? How do I make sure that I've got the right test value each and every time? And there are a variety of ways within the lab and validating your methods that you're sure you've got all the THC out of each different type of sample, and that you're positive you've seen all of it that goes into the equipment then. And those are the two parts for a lab that are certainly most important. Some of the test types that we do are listed here. We'll do cannabinoid profiling, terpene profiling. We were the first laboratory to look at terpenes, and we started looking at 35 different ones. It's very technically complex to go hunting through that forest and finding all of those different components, and to run that in a commercial fashion takes some very sophisticated scientific approaches to be able to do that economically efficiently. And I think the next closest lab today is testing around 6 or 8 of them. We also started testing for pesticides soon after that because of our public health and safety. It was the same equipment with different detectors. We kind of have 2 pieces of equipment in one. And microbiological contaminants are the other ones. And we test for all the living organisms that are microbiological. The 5th type of test that's not listed here is a residual solvent test within the concentrated forms. That's become much more important in California because the use of solvents to process cannabis is technically illegal in California. While Colorado and Washington are free to use propane, butane, and whatever else types of tanes that they might want to use, we in California are not allowed to do that. But unfortunately, it's very, very prevalent that people are still using butane. It's an exceptionally inexpensive method. It's very cheap and easy to go buy some tubes and push a can of butane over your plant material, but it's exceptionally unsafe. And I bet every one of us here has heard of one of those stories where someone's blown up their house or their neighborhood in some fashion by unsafely handling butane. And that's the reason that law exists, at least here in California. So I'll talk about the contaminations that we see. And we use the word pesticide in regulations as a much more catch-all. From a chemist standpoint, when I hear the word pesticide, I think of about 6,000 different compounds. And there's no way that any laboratory is going to look for all of those at once. But we really are talking about pesticides and herbicide, fungicide, rodenticide, and even plant growth regulators. So any types of compounds that may be added to aid in cultivation to either boost the size of the plant, which would be the plant growth regulators, or to eradicate any type of pest problem. Good, natural, healthy cannabis, typically outdoors, really doesn't have much pest problems. I mean, you have to think from the plant's perspective, it's this defenseless organism standing there in the wind, and there could be bugs, there could be other things that come up to it. It uses its own internal chemicals to try and mitigate those attacks from those other types of bugs and problems. Breeding, for our purposes or for adult use purposes to try and increase the psychoactivity, has knocked out some of the plant's natural defenses. Taking it indoors has taken it away from its natural environment to where it may be succumbing to or experiencing other types of pests that aren't present in its natural outdoor environment. Therefore, you have other problems. And because this is currently quasi-legal, if not illegal in some places, and people are motivated to making a commercial amount of money on top of a very small amount of space, they're motivated to eradicate whatever pests might show up. And with no regulations and no quality control, anything that can go out to the market can be brought out to the market. And then, therefore, you have pesticides or other fungicides and other problems that could be laden on top of the plant. From an analytical chemistry perspective, it's an exceptionally complex problem. There are many, many different types of chemicals to look at. We're trying to find the needles in the haystack because it's a very small amount sometimes that can be very harmful to people. And it is an ongoing challenge, kind of like a cat and mouse game, a little bit more related to what you would think about with athletes and doping and the next type of HGH that they may be using. So if we list exactly which compounds we use, the cultivators may choose to use different ones. And meanwhile, the chemical companies are coming up with other ones that will currently get onto the market in Home Depot or Rosemania, and other people then can start to buy those as well. So it's a constant evolution for us. But I'll still show you the list briefly. We do have about 30 to 40 different types of chemicals that we look at to try and cast a broad net as much as we can. It's certainly not perfect. We can't find everything possible. There are limitations, and no one had done any of this before. So we took the EPA's allowable daily intake limits and calculated what might make an acceptable type of standard to start with. And it's probably a little bit on the less cautionary side. We don't want to be, freaking everyone out or rejecting things. Where exactly that should be needs a lot more detailed study so you can understand what limits should we set an inhalable product at. We have to use the guide of apples or pears or other fruits and vegetables as to where do we start with in terms of how many milligrams per gram of this component are present on cannabis to call it a fail. Within California, any use of pesticides is illegal. The California Research Commission deemed that since the US EPA has no application standards for any sorts of pesticides or anything of that type within cannabis, all use of anything like that is currently illegal in California. That's an interesting problem for a laboratory. Looking at zero is maybe somewhat capable, but you can go out to many, many, many decimal places, and it could have been runoff on a water and the cultivator never used it. I don't think saying zero is a good acceptable regulatory limit either. We have to have better sensibility than that. So we took a very small individual who may be consuming a rather large amount of cannabis each day in 10 grams. But when you think about concentrated forms, that would only be approximately a gram of concentrate, and I think that's possible. I've unfortunately seen YouTube videos of people doing that at once. So that was kind of how we got to this ballpark of where to start with. And the regulators have been appreciative of that work. So we start offering pesticide tests, and the first question we get is, well, how do you know that that's even going to harm me? And I think that's an exceptionally fair question. We're certainly not trying to offer tests so that we can make money on it. Our goal is public health and safety, and we felt that it was a concern based on previous cigarette understandings that you could inhale compounds that were present on tobacco. But we sought to study these types of scenarios with cannabis. And what you see here on the one side, the left side, is a typical water pipe, and it has the option for filters, virgin coconut carbon and organic cotton. And on the right is your typical handheld, glass pipe. And we use this device, those in three fashions, the one with and without filters and the glass pipe, to try and understand how much of these types of agents, if they were put on top of cannabis, could actually potentially be inhaled. And to us, the results were quite alarming, because there are some that you can inhale quite a bit on. And with filters, it certainly seemed to slow that down a considerable amount. That made sense, because that's why you see filters on the end of cigarettes. They're not too concerned with how much you may be inhaling. They consider you're killing yourself anyway, so they didn't set any strict pesticide limits with tobacco. But in this case, it's a medical context. I think it's exceptionally important that you don't have to inhale anything like that. And in an unregulated market, it would be good to use a filtered type device or know where your medicine's coming from. So we took that a level further, and that's what we published inside the Journal of Toxicology to study those 4 specific compounds in a quantifiable fashion. It's an enormous amount of scientific work to be able to go and do that quantifiably at those small limits in a repeatable fashion. And thankfully, we had a really excellent intern from the Pasadena Community College that was there to help us do all the work, because it was very, very time-consuming. And what we found from that was up to 70% of the pesticides that we placed on the flower material could be inhaled with the handheld pipe. And I think that was what was so alarming to us, that such a huge amount of pesticide material could be transferred. And you have to consider when you inhale, it's much like injecting it straight into your bloodstream. You don't have the first pass metabolism with the liver. You don't have lack of absorptivity going through the stomach or gut lining. It's a very different equation when you're inhaling things. In the pharmaceutical world, when you inhale medication versus taking it in an oral form, the levels of contamination or residuals that they may have are usually 10 times more stringent. So inhaling is usually 10 times more sensitive than if you're going to orally consume. It's kind of a decent general rule. Microbiologically, what we see is also quite concerning. I would say the way that we do that, we have a very rapid microbiological testing platform that we can test mold in 48 hours. The market in California moves exceptionally fast, so it is very important to not leave a fresh product sitting on the shelf for a while you test. And if it needs to be delivered fresh, which I think it should be to the patients, we can't hold it up by testing for 5, 7, 10 days to look for mold. Meanwhile, mold's growing on the product because it's being stored improperly. So we look to adapt and develop a very rapid platform, and we currently go out and test almost all of our products at the USP level for a nutraceutical type product. And what those levels are how many colony forming units per gram are you allowed to have. And what we find is quite alarming in that context too. About 25% of the samples that we see or randomly select have failed some sort of gold level in the microbiological context. And that can be total aerobic count, which are bacteria that live with oxygen, enterobacteria, which are gram-negative bile-resistant bacteria such as E. coli, salmonella, and things of that type. Or yeasts and molds. And most often it's yeasts and molds that fail, but unfortunately we do see enterobacteria failing too. We don't look at specific organisms. It's just a rapid yes or no type screen at those types of levels. What we see in terms of pesticides being present, it's around 10%. And I would, put a little caveat on that number. We're most often getting what someone knows is already clean. They're aware that we're going to be able to find a lot of things, so we're not seeing a lot of samples that are necessarily random. We do see that from some of the dispensary operators. We've gone around and selected, and we've even done small studies in certain regions in Southern California where we saw up to 35% of what we collected was actually failing the pesticide screen. And concentrates seem to be much more prevalent, because I think it comes from trim or lots of different batches, and you can see those being present in a lot of ways. So I'd say that is definitely alarming that, maybe half of what you're looking at sometimes is contaminated in some fashion or another. And they may not have immediate impacts, but we have seen some patients said, I really felt sick on this particular concentrate. Can you check it? And we did find a plant growth regulator. I can't say that's exactly what the cause was. That was a single person type study. But it certainly, when you look at some of the potential toxicity effects or, the side effects that come from the rat studies in some of these compounds, it certainly seems to make a great deal of sense that they are prevalent on the market. And you may be subjected to it today, but not tomorrow. So it might build up or it might not, depending on the supply chain that you're actually plugged into. And residual solvents, we found quite an alarming amount of those, and we will be publishing a paper on concentrates and residual solvents later this year. I think all that says is we really, really need some serious regulations within California to help us clean up our supply, especially in a medical patient context. There are people that are immunocompromised, they're undergoing chemotherapy, they're very sick with antibacterial loads. We can't be subjecting them to more of those types of potential harmful contaminants when they're trying to find that as a medicine source. We use the same types of equipment that a pharmaceutical company would use. So this is modern day, ultra-fast liquid chromatography. And this allows us to do a very soft, room temperature, gentle type approach when we profile for cannabinoids. And with that, we can see all of them, the cannabinoid acids and the neutral cannabinoids. And the idea of this tool is that if you look on this side, you'll see most of those peaks are generally together. It's not very well resolved. And typical conventional liquid chromatographs would have to run exceptionally long periods of time. You'll see the run on the top is over 50 minutes. So that doesn't really work very well in a high throughput commercial sense either. So we adapted the ultra-fast methods, And what you can see is much shorter run times on the bottom, only 30 minutes, and much greater resolution. And the greater resolution is the important part with cannabis because there are so many types of compounds present on the natural plant material. So you have the cannabinoid acids and also the neutral cannabinoids in a variety of different extents depending how old or how fresh it may be, and we need to be able to look for all of those. So our runtime's not 30 minutes, but it feels like it every day. And what some of those who are familiar with the community and understand the different analytical approach, most traditionally, and what's been used by the UN for so long, has been gas chromatography. And gas chromatography heats the sample before it gets to the detector. And if we remember from the beginning of the talk, if I did a decent job so far, heating the sample will cause the cannabinoid acids to change into the neutral cannabinoids. So no more THCA is understood, you'll see THC. Why would I want to do that if I was the UN? Because it makes my legal arguments in court a whole lot easier if I'm the authorities. I don't have to worry about saying there's this much THC and that much THCA, and then showing some jurors an algebraic equation to saying how much THC might show up. It's way easier to just say, there's that much THC in this plant material, this guy's a criminal. But looking at it in a medical context, and some people may want to juice the plant or consume the plant raw, which I think is an excellent anti-inflammatory approach to consuming cannabinoid acids, you need to know exactly what you're holding. And if it's a baked good or an edible, how well has that, or how poorly has that been activated or deactivated, basically, towards the cannabinoid acids or the neutral cannabinoids. And that's exceptionally important in dose. So here's an example. If I am to take an edible compound or an edible product and look for the cannabinoids in there with using each of these types of tools, the liquid chromatograph does things at room temperature, so I can see exactly what I'm holding. And the gas chromatograph will heat things up, cause the decarboxylation, and then give me only a THC value. And what might happen is inaccurate and misdosing. So that was the predominant driver for us in making our equipment selection. It definitely was not the cheapest one to get started. And as an entrepreneur looking to bootstrap to get going, you have to carefully pick all of your equipment exceptionally well. But medical needs, accuracy needs, and scientifically, we had to go with the liquid chromatograph. And this example will show you how dangerous it can be if you inaccurately are analyzing an edible product with a gas chromatograph. Some people say the gas chromatograph will tell you this is what you inhale. Sorry, that's not true either. We have studies that show you don't actually get 100% conversion like you see within a good gas chromatograph. Improperly configured gas chromatographs can also make CBN, so we know that's not there, that's inaccurate. And if you want the cannabinoid acids, you can't see it with a gas chromatograph. So getting that dose right in any type of product, I think, really requires the use of a liquid chromatograph. So a little bit of a summary about some of the example results that you see. You'll hear people talking about 30% THC being present within their product. And really, that should send up a red flag that that's most likely not true. Unfortunately, the movie Savages probably raised that number a little bit higher. I think they said like 34% in there. And that's definitely, I don't think any of us have ever seen anything like that. But I would say anything over, lower 20s is pretty rare. Most of what we see are in the teens. And we are usually seeing, some of the better material, not the worst material. People don't often like to pay to hear that it's not very good. So I would caution anyone that's seeing, very, very high numbers consistently. And to us, it's not only about the THC value, but it's about the right value. It can have however much THC or CBD or whatever components you want. Accuracy and analytical accuracy, making sure we get the same reproducible number are what's important. And there is no such thing as the highest THC is better. It's not for everyone. It's a very individualized medication. So each person might need a very different set of cannabinoid values and terpene values. It's about the whole plant. So we don't really play the marketing game in terms of that. And I thought it would be useful to try and offer a little bit of some more understanding about how the numbers may actually be reflected. We usually report cannabinoid values in weight percent, and if a patient's saying, well, this says 15% THC, how do I know how much I should be using and how do I calculate that? It's a simple factor of 10. So move the decimal place 1 point and you'll have 150 or 154 in this example, milligrams per gram. So 1 gram of cannabis can contain up to 150 milligrams of THC if it's reported to have 15% THC as its weight percent value. And how do you calculate this is where it becomes a little bit more complicated with a liquid chromatograph. Because you can see both of the components, THCA and THC, and you'll see a little bit of THC present from the heat or the lights or the drying process or the transportation process sometimes that has caused that to form. The number that we would report on the label would be 16.6 out of these two examples here of 17.8 and 0.99. And how do you get there? It relates to the molecular weight. So this is where chemistry haunts everybody, and it's definitely the most horrifying algebraic equations you could imagine. But we do this in a pretty simple fashion, and we just spit that value as the maximum value you could get from heating all of the THCA into THC. So it's a theoretical value that if all of this natural THCA was converted to THC upon decarboxylation, how much THC could I get out of there? And that serves as a good standard for every lab to report on. It's not how much you're going to inhale because it's not 100% efficient when you do that. But if you are going to extract and concentrate and further process, it does give you a good guide and estimate as to how much you should be capturing. And we call that mass balance so that you can actually watch what's going on. And I think the easier way, using Avogadro's numbers and how many moles are present, how many molecules are actually making these things up. If I was to be able to weigh the exact same number of molecules on the scale, THCA weighs more than THC. So if someone says, you know, I've got a crystalline solid and it's 100% THC, they are completely wrong. THC is an oil and THCA is a solid. So they may have 100% THCA, and I'd really question that one too, but that would only lead to 87.7% THC because there's a factor of 12.3 in difference in the molecular weight. So I apologize for the chemistry there. But I think it's important if you're looking at labels and you want to understand, you know, what each lab is probably telling me. So for us, we were very concerned when we first started with the edible market and what's actually present on those labels, because you see a lot of different labels in terms of X. I have a bigger number X, I have more stuff that I've put in there, and it's much more stronger for everybody, so it's going to be more potent. And that is absolutely untrue. What we have seen was X means nothing. It's not a universal standard. This guy might have taken 200 times as much as he had done the very first time, and that's why he calls it 200X. He may have just thrown 200 or 100X on there to try and make it look better than the other edible next to him, and really doesn't make any sense at all. I think the best way to label edibles is to quantify the number of milligrams that are present within there and tell everybody how many milligrams of the active ingredients they may be consuming at once. And here's a good example of some of a small survey that we had a while ago. And I think that one of the easier ways to look at it is the top result is a 28-gram edible that had 200 milligrams of THC in it. Whereas the bottom one is a 60-gram edible that only had 25 milligrams. Now, these guys, 5X was on the bottom, so I still don't know what X is, and that doesn't tell me anything, because if that's 5 times greater than the other ones that are half the size, you can see how misleading that may be to a patient walking into a dispensary saying, I want, a lot. I want to pay, if I'm going to pay good money, I want a lot of bang for my buck. So how do I get the one with the most, cannabinoids in there? Well, X is not going to tell you that. The only way you can get that is through laboratory testing and actual accurate quantifying of the results, which would be done with a liquid chromatograph. So we've also seen pretty significant amounts of THCA inside of some edible producers' products. And it seems like they just kept throwing more and more and more plant material in there till they've reached that physiological desired effect. But in fact, if they would have worked with a laboratory to know they should be fully activating their concentrate, they would perform maybe more optimized methods with their butter timing and their cooking process, and would end up using like a fraction of the plant material they're currently using to get there. And that's a matter of efficiency and effectiveness of your process. And efficiency with something that's this expensive, I can't stress, that's hugely, hugely important to both the manufacturer and the patient in the end. So efficiently using this plant is of the utmost concern, I'd say, as it's still not readily available in a very inexpensive fashion. So I mentioned that in 2011 we started to begin testing for terpenes. And the reason that that was driven was there was certainly some very early research from the Netherlands, but quickly in our lab, you can test 3 different varieties that all have 15% THC, 15%, 15%, yet they all make us feel drastically different. And why is that? Even if you try and control the amount and the dose. And I think anyone that's come across cannabis knows that it smells different, and different smells may be lended towards different effects. And the smell compounds are not the cannabinoids. You cannot smell THC acid. You can't smell THC. They're not volatile like that. You're smelling the lighter terpenes. So there is something our nose tells us as the first detector. And then physiologically, we notice that it's definitely different. So we sought to understand that in a much better fashion by searching for all of the terpenes. And what's present there is an example of some of the profiles we give on our results. And that gives a nice graph to try and say, here's the chemical fingerprint for what we're looking at. And then different cultivators can lay those on top of themselves and say how different is theirs than the others. Patients can use that as a tool to start to find which particular strain is best for them. So it's being classified now in a more formal scientific context as the entourage effect. What else is going on in conjunction with these cannabinoids? What's going along in the whole plant products that is causing the various effects that you see from different varieties? What's up there in terms of the small definitions of those very few terpenes are coming from single molecule studies. So I see this a lot by many other marketing efforts inside of the cannabis community. They'll say THC is good for this and this, and CBD is great for this and this and that. So if you have this ailment, you should look for a strain with that. Well, they all have some of them in there, so how much do I need and which one's right for me? I can't take a single molecule study and say because it's a good bronchodilator, I have to get the one with the most pinene in there. It may be a good indication that you'll get some of those effects, but we definitely do not fully understand the combined effects with cannabinoids and terpenes together. I think that still remains to be figured out. But it certainly is, to me, one of the most interesting aspects of what's going on today. So we've been able to take a large number of samples now over the last few years, and ones with heavy replicates of the same names, and do what's called principal component analysis. And this is a mathematical approach to try and figure out how I can take a large sample set, weighting each of those types of molecules or individual components, and figuring out what causes the most diversity, yet still may lend towards clustering of certain types. So in a complex sense, what's very similar or what's very different, and what's causing these similarities or differences. And what you generate are these things called scatter plots. And this is, I think, what's currently the most interesting thing going on in California. You hear in a dispensary, and I'm sure most all of us here have heard, sativa causes me to feel awake and energetic, indica causes me to feel sedated and sleepy, and a hybrid somewhere in between. Well, what our data says is they're all calling that something for marketing reasons, and really there is no rational reason that it's being labeled as sativa, indica, or hybrid. It might be a morphological distinction of what the plant looks like, how long its flowering time is, what types of leaves it may have, but in terms of the chemicals present and which physiological effects you may get from those chemicals, that indication means absolutely nothing. And I think it is morally and ethically incorrect to tell a patient, this is a sativa, this will make you feel awake, or the insomniac, hey, this is an indica, this will put you to sleep, when in fact it has, uplifted type effects. So at midnight, this poor individual is going to consume their medical cannabis, believing that it's going to put them asleep when in fact it makes them awake. And I couldn't think of anything almost more torturous than something of that effect. So I think we owe it as a community and to ourselves, and certainly those patients who are relying on that information, to further understand this in a much better context. And what this graph shows us and this data analysis shows us is in California, we have no idea what any sativa, indica, or hybrid definitions really mean. And they certainly don't mean anything according to their effects. So you'll see some of the strain names that are popularly used. And Jackarere and Trainwreck have some very distinct terpene profiles, and that's probably why those are clustering up in the left-hand corner a lot more than the other ones. And they're certainly unique, but they can also be confounded and confused themselves. And what we're still not quite sure of is how many different phenotypes there may be out there, how many different times the names may have changed, and what is actually the original authenticated variety before 50 of them show up in all the dispensaries down there when it was just released, or you just heard the name mentioned in some sort of latest rap song. So all of a sudden, Girl Scout cookies is everywhere, and I'm sure the cultivator didn't provide that much product to the market in a day. So that, to me, that says something too, that the marketing going along with the strain names and the variety names is really confounding what the patients should be looking for. And if I'm a cultivator or a breeder who's worked hard on that type of product, that type of integrity that goes along with the name I've created and my brand associated with that is extremely important to me. And I think that would be extremely important, certainly up here into this community. And it's very important to the patients who are going to go look for, certain type of Blue Dream or so-and-so's certain type of Jack Herer, because that was the one giving them their preferred and predominant medical effects. So what you see here is kind of what terpenes are making this happen. And what you can't quite see is in the top is terpinolene. That's what's prevalent in Jack Herer and Trainwreck. So that's why those are all being pulled up to there, and they definitely have a unique chemical signature that we can see. And to the other side, you'll see things like germacrine, and limonene is very prevalent on the far outside part. So ones that are high in those start to pull to the left or to the top left or to the right. What's most interesting about this analysis is where THC falls, because it's right smack in the middle. And what that tells us is that THC makes no difference to any of the varieties that we've been analyzing. So when someone says, I want a lot more THC, I want a little THC, that may be just a matter of how much they need in general, but it doesn't dictate which strain or variety is best and possible for them. It's much, much more complex than just a lot of THC or a little THC. It's a matter of what else is going along with it. And you'll see CBD is right here. So we don't have very many CBD strains within our data set because they're just simply not that prevalent in California. So looking at this in a slightly different way, we tried to simplify the picture to say, is there any sort of sensibility coming along with some of the more popular names? And we looked at Jack Herer, OG Kush, Sour Diesel, and Trainwreck in this fashion. And again, you'll see OG Kush all the way up there, which is definitely a misnaming, misidentification, and that's certainly done because it's going to probably be sold a lot easier. So I think that's speaking to marketing purposes. There is some clustering with Jack Herer and Trainwreck, but again, we need to understand better which ones might make that a much, much more well-defined picture. And this is, unfortunately, only in 2 dimensions. We're working on a 3-dimension fashion, which might pull those apart and make a little bit more sense too. But you can even see down here, Trainwreck, which is obviously another misnaming. So we thought, let's just try and take out Trainwreck and Jack Herer because they're kind of pulling everything to the one side. Do we see any other sorts of clustering? And again, we didn't. In an ideal world, and what Bedrocan over in the Netherlands can show, is that each of their strains shows up like a little tiny cluster of dots. They're always all the same. So standardizing your cultivation practice, making sure that you know exactly every condition and everything going on with that plant every single cycle and harvest is what's separating the medical community from the current adult use community out here. And I think if patients are going to rely on a specific variety and a certain type made by a certain cultivator, it's going to have to be standardized in a much tighter fashion. And then they're going to need to work with labs to authenticate that that was exactly what they said it was, and it's always being provided in the same fashion. And that's kind of more like good manufacturing or good agricultural practices. So we had a little bit of fun too, because we were just curious, anything named Kush and anything named OG, and what you can see is that is absolutely everywhere. So ideally we would see one Kush, one OG types, or maybe multiple OG types scattered throughout the plot, but there was no sense or clustering at all. And what that says is it is rampant misnaming. And we've unfortunately witnessed that and said, just call it indica or just put that label on there. We'll just call this one OG Kush because we need to have that on the shelf. And really that's misleading and misidentifying to the patients. I think that's the unfortunate part. So what we've seen from this analysis and what we've recently come to understand is that this type of multivariate data is very useful and very powerful in understanding the different variety types. That we do know in California, sativa, indica, hybrid really is only maybe a morphological definition. It tells you what the plant looks like, but it doesn't tell you the chemicals that are being produced, and it won't lead to specific predominant effects. And I think most enlightening was that THC is not the indicator of what you've got, it's the terpenes and everything else that's going along with that particular variety that makes it of interest to different types of patient subsets. So what we currently do in trying to move towards a better system, we know that we need to come up with a new naming or classification system, and our goal is to come up with what we're calling chemotypes. We certainly are not there yet, but what we do today is offer labels of this type so that we try and put as much information out there so that the patient can understand what they're holding, what's prevalent there, and we try and list as many terpenes on the label as we can actually get on there and still be able to legibly read. And different types of groups choose to use different size of labels, so you might have different numbers on there. What we're hearing from patients is that they're very appreciative of this, and they find that if they, no matter what the name may be called, at least they know this has, the top 3 terpenes that they're looking for, and they can count on getting a more predominant effect or a more desirable one. So if I go back to the same dispensary, week after week after week, they might not have my variety, but I can read the labels and then understand that this one's the better one that I want. Because some of these places have 50 or 70 different types that turn over very quickly. I don't know if we can always rely on the poor fellow behind the counter to have been the best judge of every single one. And sometimes they may have tried multiple ones in a day before they thought they understood the effects, which maybe isn't the best indicator for a patient. So in brief summary, our goals are public health and safety, and I think our microbiological screening and pesticide screenings are first and foremost predominantly showing that effect, that it is very important that we bring much, much better and tighter regulations within California in that context. And when people ask us for tests, we'd much rather see them test for those even before THC or other content. Unfortunately, they always ask us mostly about the THC content. We have a very small group of certain dispensaries that consistently and reliably test for quality control and contaminant screening. And we think that the same name is definitely not always the same product either. So it is caveat emptor out there, buyer beware. You may have contaminants, you may not have the same thing. Really, you can try and trust your nose, but you should really look for lab-tested products that are really going to be much more reliable on that. And unfortunately, in California's system, no matter how well I do inside of the lab, it's still very difficult for me to make sure my label's not being abused or that information isn't misrepresented to the patients in some context. I think a system like Washington's, where they're going to control it before it actually shows up in the retail outlet, will go a lot better in saying that there's integrity all the way across on that label. And we hope that we can be a good scientific resource for everyone. Certainly, we're always open. Our website's available, and feel free to email, call, or send questions about anything at all. We try and be as informed as possible. We do have a lot of good inside knowledge and a lot of other stuff coming. And I'd like to thank the 2 guys that do all the work while I go around talking. Sietse Elzinga is our scientist from the Netherlands. He's an exceptionally brilliant scientist with a great deal of experience in the Dutch system and just has a wealth of knowledge pertaining to all of anything about cannabis. He's an amazing resource and knows a lot of the literature, so it's very helpful to our team. And my brother, who drives over 50,000 miles a year picking up sample after sample throughout the miserable Southern California traffic to make sure that the patients can get the medications that they want. And thank you all for your time today. 60s or 70s would have degraded to the point that we wouldn't be able to accurately understand it. I often hear, where is my Acapulco Gold? Where's my Colombian Red? Where are the varieties that I really enjoyed back, 10, 20, 30, even 40 years ago? I think when you look at our data, it says that it's all been hybridized. And I like to think of that as almost unnatural selection. The plants that were landrace type varieties or originally out in the wild, they had adapted to their environment to try and protect themselves in the best possible way. Indoor cultivation, commercialization has led towards breeding ones with a rapid psychoactive effect, perhaps even for a short duration because you're going to want to buy more that way, and trying to make larger plants in a smaller space. For commercial reasons, I get paid by grams of weight of the flower, not even actually the content. So if I produce a larger amount of buds in a shorter amount of time, I'm going to end up with a better commercial type product. And I think that unnatural selection has led towards breeds and varieties that are just very different than those original ones. And I hope as we start to, offer our lab services in different parts of the country and hopefully eventually across the world, we'll see those different varieties and can start to guide breeders in each of their local regions that may be able to then start to adapt their plant directions in other fashions to cause great variety in each local region. That'd be ideal. Sure.
So I think you said something that 70% of the chemical, or 70% of the added compounds in the cannabis can potentially be inhaled. Something like that.
The pesticides, yeah. The pesticides we put on there, 70% were captured in the glass pipe, yes.
So what are the practical ramifications or potential threats to human health that are posed by inhaling those pesticides?
So we've heard people complain of like numbness in their limbs, disorientation, dysphoria for a day, day and a half. And when you read of those types of chemicals and what types of physiological effects they have on rats, they can eventually kill them at certain levels or cause cancer or other types of problems like that. So to me, what that says is you want very low limits if you're going to set a limit to say that any of it could be used. Could it be used or not? It's how much is there in the end. So maybe it's a matter of application standards and the right ways to apply those things if we do need to use those, maybe not up to the last day of harvest, but you should only use that 2 weeks before harvest, or try another method because that chemical is just too toxic. And it also confounds all of the former studies where you hear people have done like metadata studies across a large percentage of the population. So you've used cannabis and we see a higher incidence of, pick the harmful thing that you may hear, testicular cancer. Well, I don't think that's coming from cannabis. I think it's coming from the contaminants that may be present on cannabis. And you don't know. So really you need to understand what's present from a regulated market when the cannabis is all known to be clean versus what may be going along in an illicit market where there are things that are certainly used that you don't know even how much there are. And if it's coming from Mexico, we've actually seen old samples from there that had some very different pesticides in there, ones that are currently illegal in the U.S. So it's very concerning as to what actually may be present on some of those things because they didn't really care. Does that answer your question?
Yes. My quick follow-up, though, is so when rats are ingesting these pesticides, they're not smoking them. So we are. Do we have ample scientific evidence about what the difference is between ingesting in the case of a rat and inhalation?
So some rat studies, they may inject it, which would be more similar to inhaling. Some they do put it on food and have them eat it. And what may happen is the liver may metabolize it into something less harmful or even more harmful. So there are not great known direct inhalation studies. But what this says is this is the same as injecting that into you. And there are some of those studies. An injection is usually more harmful than oral consumption. So it really relates to what limits should we be worried about, and are there some that we should absolutely take off the list or allow? Sure.
I was just thinking about her comment. We might, like we're looking at heritage tomatoes and that sort of thing, we might be looking at heritage pot strains at some point, see if those
Yep.
My question is, what percentage do you estimate marijuana is tested for these exact compounds and for pesticides? What percentage of the total crops in California is tested now?
So what percentage of the crops in California are being tested for like contaminants or even profiled of that type? I can't really fathom a guess, but it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction. I mean, probably less than 1%. I certainly am not overwhelmed. There's only 3 of us, right? We're not running 50 pieces of equipment to try and capture every single thing that's going along in the market. So it's a very, very small percentage of what's currently present out there.
Each year you've been in business 3 years.
Mm-hmm. It has increased, yeah. And I think as we've seen maybe different mentalities entering the market, people that are more concerned about different purposes, I'd say, for being there, we are seeing more and more people taking an interest in testing. And certainly Sanjay Gupta's weeds episode actually caused a lot more people to just want to profile for cannabinoids and look for CBD. Because while you may feel that THC is present right away, you kind of don't really feel CBD, but it's exceptionally important for people that are looking for the medical benefits derived from that and that are interested in a non-psychoactive form. So we have seen it start to slowly uptick, and I hope that continues too.
Two relatively simple questions. One to follow up on what you just said. The levels in Colorado that we heard of, Sandy Gupta's episode, prior to that, the Brothers strain, CBD is 17%, THC is less than 1%. how dependable is that figure?
It's very tough. If you're using the liquid chromatograph, CBD acid, CBDA, is the molecule you look for, and there is no commercial standard. So you actually have to prepare that yourself and do that in such a fashion using multiple pieces of equipment to know its purity. It's kind of like you need to use orthogonal equipment to know that I didn't look at it just one way and think it's good. I looked at it 3 ways to know that every way said it was pure. That way I'm sure it's pure, and I know exactly what's there. So it's possible they have isolated that, and it's not as pure as they think it is, therefore their values would be reported as higher. So that's a very tricky one. We have seen ones with similar types of 20-something to 1 ratios. So it is present within California as well. They just call it mostly ACDC, or it was misnamed as Oracle. And there are other ones also known as Jane Doe and Super CBDX that are out there as well with those types of ratios.
My second was the cannabinoids that you test for, are you going to be looking for others in the future, seeing as a cultivar may appear that has a high level of cannabinoids you don't test for?
Yep, certainly with CETA and my abilities, we have the scientific capabilities of isolating anything and making that a standard the right way so that we can detect that in the future. If we see something rare show up, we run right to the cultivator and grab it and ask them, can you please donate some of the medication so we can start quantifying those types of things for everybody in the future. And that was how we got CBG as well. So yes, if there is something rare that shows up and the cultivator hasn't gotten rid of all of it or thrown it away for whatever reasons, then yes, we can go get that. And we certainly look to the community for that. We can't create the plants or the different variants of that, but they're noticeable when we see them on our chromatogram, and would be happy to go chase that and spend the time and effort to get a standard for that so we can then include that in all the reporting. Yep. We'll go back there.
Talk about the carrier effect of terpenes. How much is that actually researched? And also, your slide, you had descriptors of different physiological effects related to each terpene. So I was wondering also what research you did with that.
So there has been a lot of studies on individual terpene components, and more so, though, in essential oils, which is confounded by all the other terpenes or things they didn't identify in that particular plant. So lavender has a lot of linalool, but it has a lot of other things, too. So if someone studied lavender, they weren't just studying linalool, which is kind of the difficult part in pulling that out. And that's the same problem then. Well, linalool with THC might have very different effects than linalool with one of the other components inside of the lavender plant. Ethan Rousseau published in the British Journal of Pharmacology Beyond THC, talking about the entourage effect. And there are some clues coming about that, but I don't know of any well-detailed studies that have even classified, the varieties very well to say these are the types of terpenes along with these cannabinoids that carry this effect. GW Pharmaceutical took Sativex, which is THC to CBD, almost a 1-to-1 ratio, and they say there's extra terpenes, but they don't say what they are. And I don't believe they classified all of them for the FDA, or they at least told them that these are from the plant and they're all still natural and they're generally regarded as safe, but they're not our active ingredients because we don't want to have to go and chase every single one of those in a fully FDA-compliant clinical study. It makes much, much more complicated. There is very, very little today that has been formally studied in any sort of clinical context about that. And even some of the California studies that are done in a clinical context for pain just said this much THC. And they don't even tell us how much CBD, CBG went along with it, or what other terpenes in that variety were helping to cause, mitigation or exacerbation of pain related to THC. They've only looked at it in a very simple context. So unfortunately today, we don't have much solid info other than the semi-anecdotal or the starting to be organized information throughout dispensaries within the states that have legalized medical use. Does that answer your question? We are aiming towards creating like a community-based platform that people can plug into along with the data so that we know this is the variety, this is the effects, and this is what people should be looking for. And I hope, it won't take too much time until we can actually get to a place where we could really aid patients in finding the right thing without having to guess for like the first 3 months to figure out what might work for them. So does CBD interact differently with central nervous system or peripheral receptors? Is that what you're saying? I don't quite understand your question. Like, there are many different. Yeah. Oh, right. So how many isoforms of the same ones might there be? I'm not sure. They're just calling them CB1, CB2, CB3. They haven't said like alpha, beta. I believe there is some work being done on that, and that there are certain isoforms that may cause different populations to respond differently to like a cannabinoid medicine. But I couldn't speak fully on that one. It's pretty new, but I believe there are some isoforms. And I don't remember exactly if they were saying that it was in different ethnicities even, that there were certain types of populations that had different isoforms of that. Because certainly a point mutation may cause that receptor to be just a little bit different, which causes that molecule to go in there and elicit a different response. So I think in theory you would say there definitely are, but I don't have much research done on that. Sure.
We've gone so many 40 years without knowing what you are now telling us. I mean, I'm hearing little stuff that I was obviously
Yeah.
It was because it's a Schedule 1 substance. What restraints have you? Is it because you're in California and we get to study and put it in?
I'm a California patient.
Again, is the feds coming down after you?
I hope not. I hope the feds are not coming after me, but I do not know. We are surveying, we are providing information to the public. The state has asked for this type of product. Certain states now are mandating that labs exist and are required. And I think if we're ever going to properly reintroduce this into society in any fashion, we need a solid scientific understanding of that. So I don't know. I do not have a federal license to do what we do, but I have a state patient recommendation where all patients, and we handle those, access the medication according to that and are understanding it for our own medical needs as well as others. And we're just choosing to share that with everyone.
What kind of regulations do you have to follow to do your lab work?
The standard, like a standard analytical laboratory work, but it's pretty wide open. I mean, unfortunately today in California, anyone can pretty much call themselves a lab. Which is, sometimes very demeaning to the word. But there's no qualification. Other states have started to set that up where they would like to see certain degree credentials, certain years of experience in laboratories, certain protocols be in place, but it's not here in California by any shape of the means. But I think it will be coming soon, hopefully.
And is your company doing something other than just getting down to the nitty-gritty of analyzing the substance? Are you doing anything about expediting a climate where you are in fact encouraged? I mean, it seems like we're just running around on the surface of a ball, like it's all in there.
Yep. We're first trying to figure out how big the ball is, and then maybe we'll go inside of it a lot deeper. Yep. Yeah. Yep. There's no concerted, focused effort by, I'd say a giant consortium of let's go understand cannabis. We're just saying, hey, this is some interesting stuff. Maybe we're leading the way. I think it would be great if we had many, many different types of people doing different types of things. This is such a giant iceberg, and we're just scratching the surface that I would be remiss to say that we're going to be the only ones to look at the whole thing. That's silly. I think that we should encourage more and more scientists like myself, and I hope we're setting a good entrepreneurial model to say if you're interested in going after something that you could spend the rest of your life looking at, this is a pretty good opportunity and maybe a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that's out here. And we do focus a lot. I've spoken to, Connecticut, Colorado, Washington, Nevada, a lot of different state regulators to try and help them set up good laboratory regulations and understandings so that, more confident scientists can jump into that and actually get licensed to go out and do it. Because it would be very nice to have a laboratory license inside of California to say we can do what we're doing. But unfortunately, we don't have that today.
I have a more specific question about circumstances here in the North Coast, and this is something called white powdery mildew. And I wondered if you had done any of your studies of molds and so on, if that particular one you have any data reflecting it or talking about what it does or doesn't do?
Not specifically, no. And I think if it shows up to the point that they visibly see it, we never get to test it. they've never brought it to the lab. They know it's going to fail. So we have not seen much of that, and we. Yeah. So mold is present everywhere too, right? Like they're always ubiquitous, and it's a matter of the colony forming units per gram is a matter of how much of that is present. So setting that level to a place where people can overcome that and it still would be considered relatively safe. That's why we chose like USP nutraceutical standards to get started with. Something like USP pharmaceutical standards, maybe much more would be failing. But we also know, some people may be irritated by that. They may be getting sick for that. But we have no solid concrete studies on how much is actually that problem. Our screening test for live organisms, and the idea is that if you're over that value, you probably have much more potentially harmful mycotoxins, aflatoxins, and other types of things that those organisms may create. So it's really a combined picture, but we don't really have very good data on any of that. Oops, sorry. One more.
Last question is that consistency is the number one importance to your objective analysis. And do you have, what kind of consistency do you have in terms of genetics of grow labs that provide you with the art? And if you got a producer, how much does it cost you to get things done?
So we don't have very many close relationships with a well-controlled, repeatable producer, which is what you would need to actually go about studying that in a good context. For whatever reason, because we're geographically down in Los Angeles, or they're just not inclined to go about understanding that at that level, doesn't matter, I'm still making my stuff, it's fine. We have not been able to really get close with certain cultivators to standardize their practice and understand how they can optimize it. Yeah, a few guys we've seen, maybe I can motivate them the right way. A few guys we've worked with in that fashion, we've done a time course study so that you can say which week should I be harvesting. Instead of thinking that it's white, clear, milky, amber trichomes that lead me to saying when I should pick this effect, how about you do it based on a chemical marker? Say, most people are after THC. So if you want the maximum THC that your plant produces, we'll track that over time. And what they found out was it was 2 weeks earlier than they thought it would be. That shaves off 2 weeks of harvest time, right? What does that mean? Extra cycles in the year. What does that mean? You paid for more than the test that you paid me for. So I think economically it makes a great deal of sense to work with a laboratory in that context. To understand the variety and lock it down and make sure I bred for the right one makes a great deal of sense. And to prove that it's been standardized time and time again. We unfortunately have had the case where it was really good, and it fell off, and then we never saw that cultivator again. So they didn't want to put that type of label on there because they like to say they're the best all the time, which would be ideal, and you can get there, but it's extremely difficult to do. So it kind of puts a different level of a lens on them, and it makes it much more difficult to do their job, and they haven't been maybe amenable towards jumping into that pool just yet. But the smart ones will do so, and they'll be ahead of the crowd, in my opinion. We start at $50 per test. So 4 tests up there would be $200, and that usually covers 1 pound or more pounds, depending on how we pick the sample and what we actually get prepared. And in bulk, you can do it even cheaper. So it's certainly, and for purposes of the time course study and optimizing what you're doing, we offer bulk like research type rates where you can design the right experiment, get the right data with the least amount of tests so that it's not costly to anybody. Yep, or just send us an email. We don't publish our prices, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
What is a plant that's close to the cannabis plant in terms of overall properties? Like what's related to that? And are there other sources of these compounds?
Yep. So the closest, what's the closest relative to cannabis is hops. So a lot of people have seen that. A lot of terpenes are the same in both of those, and you may be getting different microbrew beer effects from the different terpenes that you're actually ingesting. So some beer feels different than other beers, right? And that's predominantly because of the hops that they're using.
So can you smoke hops and get the similar?
I don't know if I go that far to smoking hops. Might get a headache, but
smoke hops and get similar CBD.
So there are very, very few plants that have known cannabinoids present, and someone actually misidentified flax as having it. It doesn't have any in there to what the follow-up said. So there are, I don't remember the names, but I think there are like 2 other ones that have cannabinoid type molecules present, but they're really not prevalent anywhere. Yeah. I think that's it. Yeah. Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about these super concentrates, what you're seeing with respect to contamination levels, pesticide, herbicide residues in those?
Yep. So we see more, like, what do we see inside of concentrates is your question, and we see definitely more prevalent contamination in terms of residual solvents like butane or isobutane, or even, unfortunately, we've even seen horrifying things like acetone, isopropanol, or octane, thanks to Rick Simpson telling everybody they should use naphtha. And we've once detected benzene, which is a known carcinogenic agent. So how your concentrate is made is exceptionally important to what's being present as far as a residual solvent. Contamination-wise, in terms of pesticides, we do see higher amounts of pesticides being prevalent within the concentrates as well. It's easier for us to find, and yeah, you're concentrating that with everything else too. So now it's not perhaps diluted amongst cellulose on the plant material, it's concentrated in just, you know, that type of form with a much more simple matrix. So it does concentrate those types of pesticide residues and chemical contaminants inside of that. We actually have to deal with trim that's going to be concentrated in a different fashion, because if we look at it the same way, we might not detect there are pesticides present at those levels, and the concentrate that comes out from that shows that it's there. So we have to do some different lab techniques to actually say if this is going to be used in that fashion, whether you want to proceed with your extraction or not. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, do you find any elevated heavy metal showing up in any of these, particularly the outdoor, because cannabis is a real fiber mediator?
Right. I suspect there may be, but we don't do heavy metal testing. That's that would not go well in a voluntary market, and the equipment is about $250,000 infrastructure improvement we'd need to make to watch 5 people do that in a year. It probably wouldn't pay. So I can't do that in a voluntary market. But it is a concern. It is known to suck up a lot of chemicals of those types too. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm assuming internal standard method for quantification.
Yep. Yeah, we can do internal, external standards. There's a couple ways you can slice that.
So what do you typically use for your internal standard?
It's proprietary. So what you can use like next to anything that doesn't confound with your patients. Yep. Yep. But no, we haven't published that yet. So it's some of that allows us to move a lot faster than our competitors, and we think it's a competitive game in making sure that things are done the right way in the best possible way.
And what detection methods are you using?
So we use the UPLC with a UV detector and GCFID or GCMS for pesticides, FID for the terpenes, and UV detection for the cannabinoids. You're the chemist in the crowd, right? Yeah. No, that's cool. Next question. So butanol would be bad, but yeah, butane, it may be an irritant. It's perhaps not exceptionally harmful. Hexane is exceptionally harmful. Your body makes very bad metabolites that don't go away, so I wouldn't want to be using any of that. But butane residues, it may depend on how much is there, but it could be irritating to the throat and lungs. Maybe more so than anything metabolically.
Is it carcinogenic?
Butane itself? Not that I know of. But it would probably depend on the purity of what you've got. So the regulators in Washington and Colorado are asking for medical grade purities, 99% plus, so that you're sure there's nothing else going with it when you may be using it. Because there is some weird stuff in some of the cans that I don't think you'd want to be inhaling.
Have y'all tested any consistency levels between clones versus seeds from the same strain?
From the same strain? No. No, we know some that definitely do not like seeds, and they're just going from clones. And one comment to make on that is your clone may drift genetically after a while. Like if you try and just take clones from the same mother time and time again, it's not going to necessarily be the same plant later. You're stressing the mother, and she may turn on or turn off epigenetic controls of the future clones. So they're not going to be as consistent as you might hope. You should remother every cycle. And the other thing is we do believe that different environmental effects, if I take the same clones in different places, you will see different things, but we haven't been able to really concretely validate that yet. But I think others have anecdotally even seen that, right? They take the same clone outdoor, indoor, and it looks like a different plant. So it would make sense their chemicals are different too.
Is anybody doing genetic sequencing, and how far north of your tests?
There has been genetic sequencing done. Medicinal Genomics did a sativa and indica. They did 2 types, and someone at the University of Saskatoon did the whole genome for the cannabis plant. So that's out there, but I don't know of much genetic testing that's done on like a routine basis. Some of the other work was done at the University of Indiana, and what they saw was polyploid, like multiple copies of the same genes, and they really couldn't tell much from a genetic standpoint what was going on. So in terms of classification, what you would hope to do is just say, these are the genetics I have, but what chemicals do I produce? Because that's what's going to impact the patients at the end. So when we started, instead of saying, let's genetically type and go out that way, we're going to work backwards. Chemicals first, and then eventually, sequence. And the longer I take to do that, the cheaper genetic sequencing gets. So that'll be good for everybody. And we will happily go across most all of California. We are starting to try and get as far north as the Bay Area right now. And it's a matter of coordination and motivation. So if someone's got enough samples or wants to, look at a large amount of things, we can certainly try and make that work one way or another. Or get a bunch of your friends so that it's really worth it.
One of the problems people have encountered recently is like having too many strains and not being able to decide when you're doing genetics anything, let's say outcrosses and independent things that you maybe had for a long time, and you're in a situation where you have to make a choice. Would that be like a large amount to make a comparison? But you have 4 lines
right.
of the same thing,
yep.
And
so how can cultivators use the service to?
Yep. The plant is not
right.
telling you anything. I mean, to me,
yep.
the most surprising thing I heard tonight was a negative result on your part.
Yep. Yep. No. Okay. That makes sense to me. Your question. How does a cultivator go about selecting their varieties? What's the most important aspects that they could be looking at? So even at the very small stage of plant growth, we can look at the leaves and see the cannabinoid ratios. As they get a little bit older, it would probably be enough to start doing the terpene ratios as well. So if you said, I crossed these and I've got 6 different ones, which one might be most interesting to me? I can look at those types of ratios or those types of profiles as a whole to know how different they are all from each other. And then if you are already doing breeds, you could see what's most different from what you have. And that might be a good way to direct it. I can't predict which one is most rare in the market, which should be going after.
I was struck by the fact that you had the information about train wreck, and so I have crosses out.
Mm-hmm. That would be interesting, to see, does it keep the train wreck properties or not? So you could then take both of the parents and then the progeny from that and say which one has the characteristics of one or the other, and which one might I choose to grow out because of that. You can't predict which one's going to have which effects in the end just yet, but you can say, we could say on train wreck probably especially, this has that predominant marker set in there, and this offspring does, and so does this one, but that one doesn't. So if you're going after what makes train wreck, then go after these 2. So it could work that way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's exciting.
That's good.
I think we have time for probably one more.
Okay. Sure.
I guess since we're in Humboldt, I might as well ask this question. Are you testing much outdoor, or is it all indoor?
We see some outdoor. It's predominantly indoor, or it's at least called indoor, because that, again, we're not at the cultivation site to see that. But I say we do see some outdoor, but it's mostly indoor.
And are you seeing any difference of THC and terpenes in the indoor opposed to the outdoor?
I don't think so. You can see them still, maybe slightly higher THC values, but sometimes sacrificing other terpene values. There's only so much the plant can kind of produce and still survive. It's got critical functions it needs to perform just to exist. So it can't put all of its effort and energy into those. But we do see different ratios.
In outdoor and indoor.
What's that?
Not a vast difference.
I wouldn't say a gigantic difference, and really, like, is that question saying like which one's better, which one's not? We don't know, right? Like, whatever variety is right for the patient is what is best, and if that needs to be cultivated outdoor in a controlled greenhouse as opposed to indoor under a hydroponic system, that's what we'd like to figure out. So I'd encourage diversity, variety, and everything that we can think of, and then we can start to narrow down which people need which varieties done in which fashions.
Well, let's thank Dr. Raber. Please pick up.